But the book really tries to say that America's greatness is not in its government. It's not so much in the people we elect. It's really in the extraordinary way in which individuals live their lives out here in the heartland of America. And when they live their lives according to the right thing of treating their neighbors as themselves, then it's amazing how little solutions we'll even ask for from Washington. But the better answers for how those solutions would in fact come from out here in the heartland, where people are living in a real world, facing real problems and solving them, as opposed to people who, in the midst of trying to solve problems, raise their own salaries in Congress, seem to be completely indifferent to the real problems that many people face, and whose answer for a failing business and a failing enterprise, which has been completely mismanaged, is to turn around and to do what they have gotten in trouble doing, which is to create shoddy products, to do so with borrowed money, to borrow what they couldn't pay back. And the idea is, let's put some more money into those entities, whether they're banks, insurance companies, or car companies. Some of us would look at that and say, gee, if you're in trouble because you didn't manage well and you spent more money than you had, why would giving you more money fix the problem? But then that would make sense. And none of us really have a lot of history of seeing Congress as having made sense. And I've yet to meet any person in this country from any part of America who honestly would like to have a car designed by Congress. But that's a whole other story. Let me open the floor for questions, and I'm going to take a few questions, and Skip will moderate that, and we will... Yes?
Thank you. I had a question about Chapter 3 of your book, where you talked about the sanctity of life.
Yes.
You make a very big deal about the sanctity of life in all its forms, from conception on through death. But on page 38, you say, culture of life also mean that the state's decision to terminate a human life in the form of capital punishment would take place only after the thorough and exhaustive judicial process to protect the rights, even of the one who had committed a deed so heinous as to invoke the termination of that life. Right. So I'm wondering, does that mean that you believe the sanctity of life can be annulled by a person's action throughout their life? And if so, how are we to determine at what point that occurs?
The basic difference, and it's a very valid question, one that I think is valid not only to be asked of those of us who reluctantly accept capital punishment as a painful reality of dealing with people who have committed crimes that are so beyond really the pale of anything we can tolerate within our society that we think that there is a place. It's equally illogical for me to people who support abortion who oppose capital punishment. I've never understood that. And maybe I could ask that question of some folks, because that to me is completely illogical to say it's okay to take an innocent human life, and we think that that's perfectly okay, and you ought to defend to the death a woman's right to choose, and that's usually the euphemistic way of saying a woman's right to terminate the life of her unborn child. But I absolutely forbid under any circumstances to tolerate the notion that you could adjudicate a person guilty of serial killing and that person should be put to death for it. So, you know, the logic sometimes goes out the window, but to follow it the way I've been able to grapple with it, because for one thing, it's the law here in Arkansas. The most painful thing I ever did as governor was carry out the death penalty. When always I was asked the question, what was the hardest thing about your job? I never had a hesitator say, let me think, because I knew right immediately what the answer was. The hardest thing about the job, the most difficult, the most painful for me personally, was carrying out the death penalty, which unfortunately I had to do more than any governor in the history of the state because of some unique circumstances of the judicial system having backed up a lot of cases that then sort of were unclogged by a more recent court decision during my tenure. And the reason I say that it was the most painful was because it was the only decision I ever made as a governor that was irrevocable. Every other decision that I made, every other, somebody could come in and undo it. Like they could do something different. It was a one decision that could not be changed. And that's why it was my practice to read every single page of every bit of information on that case, several boxes filled on most cases, boxes filled with file folders. I did everything from read the autopsy report, the crime scene report, look at the autopsy photos. There wasn't one page of information I didn't go through. Was there any reason that this case should not go to the conclusion to which the law had decided it should go? I didn't make the decision to carry out the death sentence. A jury of your peers and my peers did. They made that decision. They imposed it. They passed it on. Then there were several layers of appeal through the adjudication process where that person had every opportunity to prove that something wasn't quite right in what the jury had decided. If there was a reason that the jury had messed up, it was my responsibility to halt that case. But if there was not some legal reason, I couldn't use my own conscience and say, well, I don't think I want to carry out the death penalty because I just don't like it in this particular circumstance. There were probably some I might have pulled back on just because it was extremely difficult and distasteful to do, particularly the one of Christina Riggs, the first woman, and I guess the only woman now ever executed in Arkansas. It was a horrible case. She killed her 2 children. But ultimately, the difference between the idea of taking an innocent human life and taking one in the form of capital punishment is that in the form of, whether it's euthanasia or abortion, it's basically one individual making the life and death decision. In the case of capital punishment, it is society as a whole, involving all 3 branches of government, the legislative, the judicial, and the executive, and even involving the public at large through the process of a jury selected from among ordinary people. And then there are layers and layers and years and hundreds of thousands of dollars of expense to give that accused person every opportunity to stop that process. But when the law has been determined that this person represents a significant, serious, if you will, a clear and present danger to the rest of society, as well as a way to create, hopefully, a spirit of deterrence for future similar crimes, then we have in place the form of capital punishment. To put it recently, and I'll try to keep most of the answers more brief than this, but it's a complex issue, and I think it's a great question that you raised. The case of Ann Presley. Most of us in this room, I myself knew her. She covered me both as a governor and as a presidential candidate. When I read the gruesome details and I spoke to her parents, there's a case that when you know of it, you just think, is there a solution? Is there some type of adjudication that the prosecutor should seek other than that? And that hasn't been determined yet. I understand. Hadn't gone to trial. But if that person should, in fact, be convicted and sentenced, when you think about what she went through, how you pray to God nobody ever would go through something like that again, that's when you start saying maybe there should be a form of capital punishment. And in all the cases, all of them that I dealt with, that was the ultimate conclusion to which I came. And if it had been another conclusion, I probably would have said I would then do what I did have the power to do, and which I did in one case, and that is not to eliminate any consequence, but commuted that sentence from death to life without parole. That's another option. Now, there may come a time in our society when we decide collectively that we don't want a death penalty at all. We just want to have none of it, period. If we decide that, I certainly would be able to live with it. But that's not what we have now. We have a death penalty for certain crimes, and I think about the crimes of Timothy McVeigh, the crimes of the people who committed 9/11. I'm just not sure that a death penalty is an adequate expression of our outrage and our frustration with that kind of behavior, but I'm not sure what one would be. Again, it's always an imperfect solution, and know that. It'll never be a perfect solution because we're dealing with an imperfect situation that brought it about.
Got a question over here, Annie.
Hey, Annie. How are you doing? Good to see you.
As a former state AARP member at the time you were elected as our governor, I found many of our senior citizens thought they were electing a preacher governor. The other thing that I've experienced across the country is people saying that if Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King had ever run for office because he was a religious leader, he would have never been elected to public office. How important is being a preacher as a career for many, many years and running for public office under our democratic form of government?
Annie, I don't believe anybody should be disenfranchised from running for office in a representative form of government. In fact, if anything, that would be the most un-American approach of all, to say that you can be anything in your vocation except you can't be this. I mean, if it is a representative form of government and many people in our culture and in our country are people of faith, then to say that you could be anything but a person whose vocation, at least for a period of your adult life, was related to faith, that would be the ultimate form of bigotry, the ultimate form of an affront to everything American. It was interesting to me that as a candidate for president, I was often introduced as former, Baptist pastor. And I'm thinking, that's interesting. It's been nearly 18 years since I was a Baptist pastor, but I was a governor and a lieutenant governor for a longer period of time than I was ever a pastor. And interestingly, I had more executive experience running a government than anyone, Democrat or Republican, who ran for president in the entire '08 cycle, with the sole exception of Tommy Thompson, former governor of Wisconsin, who had been a governor slightly longer than me. But more experience, executive branch, than anybody. That was never the point brought up. And what I found was that there was this sort of curiosity. I think for some people it was beyond curiosity. It was an attempt to try to minimize the fact that I had come from being a governor and dealing with issues like transportation and education and health care and budget issues and getting into the weeds of Medicaid and a whole host of things. All that got ignored. It was a frustrating part of it for me, even to this day, when people make that the centerpiece of all that I was. I mean, nobody went back and said, what did Rudy Giuliani do 20 years ago? You know, where was Barack Obama 20 years ago? Where was Joe Biden? Well, Joe Biden was in the Senate 40 years ago. Joe Biden in the Senate forever. We know what he's been doing. I'm not sure what, but he's been there. But my point is that it wasn't meant to be mean. It was just trying. He's been talking. We know Joe's been talking. But I think you get my point, is that there was a unique sort of focus on it. My answer to that was that my years as a pastor, the 12 years that I served in that position, was very important to me for this reason. There's not a social pathology that exists in our culture that I couldn't put a name and a face to. For most people who run for office, there are certain issues that for them, they've read about it, maybe they've talked to experts in the field, they've never dealt with it with their own hands. There is not one social issue, not one social pathology in this country that I couldn't put a name and a face to. You want to talk about a 14-year-old girl who's pregnant and hadn't told her parents yet? Guess who she did talk to? Me. You want to talk about an elderly couple who's cutting their medicine in half because they can't afford to take the full dose and have groceries? You know who knew that? I did, because I was in their home. I was in their hospital room in ICU at 2 o'clock in the morning when the family had to decide whether to take the plugs out and to let that person go ahead and drift into death. I was with them. I was there as they worked through that decision and struggled with it. When the teenage son was injured in a motorcycle accident, was hooked up by a breathing tube, and the family had to decide whether to undo the breathing tube and donate the organs. When the young couple was struggling with having borrowed too much money and they didn't think they could hold their marriage together because they were fighting over the money, I talked to those people. So what my point is that where some might look at that whole experience as saying, well, it kept you from life. No, it put me in the middle of it, gave me a front row to actions and issues that very few people who ever ran for anything ever knew about. And one of the reasons that I ran in the first place was my frustration with people who were in office who I didn't think had a clue about the real problems people were facing, whether it was hunger, poverty, disease, struggle with interpersonal issues, education with their kids. So anyway, it was a constant source of interest for me, Annie.
Question. Amanda.
Hi, my name is Amanda Harris. I'm a student here at the Clinton School, and it's an honor to have you here.
Thank you, Amanda.
I know you recently went on The View.
Yeah.
I enjoyed that episode. And
I survived it too, you know, that's what's amazing.
You stated your support for the passing of Initiated Act 1 here in Arkansas, which was the ballot measure that restricts foster care and adoption. And I was wondering if you can explain how you think this is doing the right thing when it could lead to children not being placed at all.
Well, I think first of all, the really major question is whether or not we believe that we should have different definitions of marriage other than the traditional definition, one man, one woman, life relationship. And the view that I have, although sometimes people try to say that's a really radical view, it's the same view that Barack Obama holds. It's the same view that Hillary Clinton holds and Joe Biden holds. And when I was on The View, in fact, and I was on Jon Stewart's daily program, and he was really very animated. He didn't really let me get many words in edgewise, and that's unusual for John. But he was wound up that night, and that's fine. But the point that I didn't get a chance to make with him was that he was acting as if Republicans and conservatives are uniquely, for traditional marriage. And I wanted to, and I think I did try to say to him, this has been on the ballot in 30 states, and in 30 states it's passed, all 30 times. Never has failed. Even in California, where Barack Obama overwhelmingly won the election, but that issue still was one that passed. The average across America is 68% of the voters when it's been put to the test. It's an issue that people can discuss, but frankly, until America decides differently, we have decided, not just Republicans, but Democrats, including Barack and Hillary and others, have a united decision that marriage should still mean one man, one woman, and the context of that traditional family should be the one in which we should put our focus and primacy. Now, when that changes, then we'll have a whole other discussion. It's still my view. It'd be a little disingenuous for me to say, oh, well, I don't really believe that, but I do. I believe it matters. And I think once we change the definition of marriage, and I know that this is a view sometimes that gets people really angry, but once we decide to change it from male-female relationship, one man, one woman, then it can mean, why not, one man, several women, one woman, several men. Although, quite frankly, I've seen a lot of times where men wanted to marry many women. I've never seen a woman who wanted to marry several men. That may be a revealing answer in itself. But without being facetious, I mean, why could we not then tolerate, or why shouldn't we not apologize to the people in West Texas who practice polygamy? Because if we have a right to change the definition, then we have a right to change it to whatever someone's lifestyle has chosen for it to be. And I don't think anybody's quite ready for us to go there.
We got time for one more question because we got a lot of book signing to be done. We have, I think, a gentleman on the back row had his hand up there. Yes, sir.
Thank you. I'll make it brief. Governor, talk about South Carolina and what happened there. I don't know, I haven't bought the book yet.
Yeah.
I will, but I don't know if you talk about it in the book or not. But South Carolina seems to be critical, and I did vote for you, by the way.
Marcus, I actually believe that you really did. Since I appointed you to the job you held, if you didn't, then we really should talk, Or then maybe we shouldn't, I'm not sure. Yeah, let me tell you, and I mentioned in the book, South Carolina was probably the turning point for the campaign. There's a little backstory that a lot of people maybe don't know, and I don't know how well it's been reported. John McCain had decided that if he lost South Carolina, he was done. He was out of gas. He pretty much spent all his money to get to there, and he rolled the dice with, if I win South Carolina, then he knew he had momentum to go to Florida. If he didn't win South Carolina, he was quitting. Let me back up a little bit. The strategies within the Republican Party were Mitt Romney believed that he would win Iowa and New Hampshire, and on the strength of and Michigan, and on the strength of that would win South Carolina and would be unstoppable. My defeat of him in Iowa, John McCain's defeat of him in New Hampshire, put everything in play, changed the whole dynamics of the race. So by the time we got to South Carolina became then a turning point. Fred Thompson's campaign never really got off ground. It was the most amazingly lackluster campaign. We all anticipated Fred's entry into the race might finish the rest of us off. I'll be honest, I've really looked at it every day, that if Fred gets in the race, all the Southern conservatives might run to Fred, we could be finished. We didn't know. And we kept waiting for Fred to get in, and if Fred had gotten in June, it might have been a different story, although he not only would have had to have gotten in, he would have had to have shown up for events sooner than noon. We used to say Fred got up at the crack of noon and tried to get an event before 1, rested a while, tried to get in one more before 6 and called it a day. I mean, I've never seen a campaign quite like that. Thank goodness. Because if he'd really had the energy, it would have been a different deal. He absolutely just was minimal in Iowa. I don't remember the percentage, but it was almost negligible. He pulled out of New Hampshire and really wasn't in play. He decided he would stay in South Carolina. He campaigned as vigorously there as he did anywhere, but he stayed basically in the northern part of the state, Greenville, Spartanburg, which is the heavy Republican conservative area, the place where most of our votes were. As late as 8:30 that night, we still thought we would win South Carolina. We even got a call. I got one from George Stephanopoulos, who called and said, we think you guys are still going to pull this out. We're looking at our numbers and where they're coming from. And, we know that right now the trend is McCain. We think you're going to pull it out. So we were hanging on. But John McCain was very strong in Charleston. It had snowed in Greenville that day, highly unusual. And Fred had campaigned hard. We ended up barely getting squeaked by McCain. And Fred only got I think 14% of the vote. He got half of what we got. But whatever he got, most of it probably came out of us. And that was the margin that we didn't win South Carolina. Us not winning South Carolina was a real blow to us. We thought we could recover, and we could have, but then the national press pretty much said, oh, well, Huckabee can't, he can't go on. He was a one-state deal. We came back, we won Kansas, West Virginia, Tennessee, Georgia, Alabama, Arkansas, West Virginia, I think I may have mentioned that, almost won Virginia, won Louisiana. We won a lot of states after that, but I don't care what we would have won. The press's attitude was John McCain has captured it, and we just could never overcome that. And that was really the beginning. But the key was South Carolina, no doubt about it. From a tactical standpoint, people have second guessed and said, "Why did you go to Michigan?" Because we spent about 3 or 4 days there that we could have spent in South Carolina. But the reason for it, maybe it was a flawed one, was that if we were seen as only competing in the South, we would be marginalized as a campaign that couldn't get out of the geographical ghetto of the South, that's where we were stuck. And so we had to show that we could be competitive in New Hampshire, in Michigan, in Ohio, in these other states. And so we chose to give it a little bit of time. We came in third in Michigan. We were respectable there. Didn't expect that we would win. Honestly, knew we probably couldn't win there. But we needed to show that we were willing to play in Michigan. That's why we did it. Let's face it, here was the deal. Fred being in South Carolina, McCain being strong in Charleston, not only was the turning point for South Carolina, that was the beginning of the McCain victory. Now, let me make one other observation about process. If you'd study the rules very carefully, what you might come to the conclusion of, I would make this argument. If the Republicans had played by the rules of the Democrats, and the Democrats had played by the rules of the Republicans in terms of how we got to our delegates, Hillary would have been the Democrat nominee, and I would have been the Republican nominee. But the problem was, in the early states, many of them were winner-take-all, and they were states like Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, in which John McCain clearly had a better constituency than I did. They were left-of-center states. They were states that were not going to be in play or have any effect on the November election for Republicans at all. Never had, never would. But they helped to determine the outcome of the primary because they were early and because they were winner-take-all, not proportional. By the time we got to the South, many of the states were proportional, which means the states that I won, like Georgia and others, I didn't get all the delegates. I only got delegates proportionate to the number of votes. So McCain still was getting delegates in places where, had it been turned around, he wouldn't have gotten any. And so, Hillary was in a very similar situation from a Democrat side, and I didn't study this as well as some of you probably have, but enough to know that, frankly, going into it, there was no way in the world I ever thought anybody could beat her. I just didn't think it was mathematically or tactically possible for her to not be the nominee. But if you look at the fact that the Democrats had some critical caucus states which were an advantage for Obama, basically because that's where organization counts more than media and money, it was a boost to him. So, but look, here's the deal. No bitter thoughts, no sense of gee whiz. Here, we all know what the rules are when we go in. And as long as we play by the rules, then, you live or die by them. So there's no sense of me saying, golly gee, it should have been. No, let me finish this way. It's the most amazing, wonderful, and thrilling experience I've ever had. And people ask me, would you do it again? In a heartbeat. Why? Not because it was about winning and losing. It was about the fact that this is still an incredible country where a person like me could run and have very limited resources and still get this close to getting there. And that's an affirmation of the system. So I didn't come away cynical or bitter or bruised or a sense of, gee, all the things that are wrong with it. There's plenty wrong with it. But I came away saying, this is a great country. And the people still get it, even if the system has some flaws. The people of America, and that's what I hope you get from the book, is that this isn't about the politicians that run, and it's not about all the processes. It's about the people who do extraordinary things to help really ordinary people like me run for office. And I hope that comes through as you read it.
Ladies and gentlemen,
Thank
a
you.
round of applause. Governor Mike Huckabee.